Hello, Shabbat
Hey,
Shalom.
Travis.
Hey,
Yeah, well, thanks for tuning in this week as we look at the Sfat Emet, whom I think we've been looking at fairly regularly lately. Um, I like him. I think he's got a lot to say on this week's Parsha, Emor. And I chose this reading today in part because I found it in some ways kind of challenging. So I'm curious and eager to explore it in conversation. So the starting point for this teaching is this verse from this week's parsha. This week's parsha, like a lot of this section of the Torah, deals with a lot of different laws and rules and regulations and commandments. And specifically, we're in the part of the Torah where we're thinking a lot about the different rules that govern the Kohanim, the priests. But the verse that starts out this teaching, which I'll read in a second, is a little bit more expansive than that, right? It's not just a rule for the priests, it's a rule for, well, it's not even actually a rule, but it's a more universal statement about the relationship of God to the Jewish people. So it says, I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. I am the Lord who sanctifies you, who brings you from the land of Egypt to be a God unto you. I am the Lord your God. So there's already a lot that we could talk about, a lot of questions that just these two verses raise for me. And Rashi gets at one of them here when he says, and this is how the Sfat Emet starts his teaching, when Rashi says, Rashi, based on the Midrash, says, for the purpose of being your God, did I bring you forth from Egypt. Which is kind of an interesting idea. It suggests on some level that God wasn't our God until after the Exodus from Egypt, that the Exodus was what enabled God to be our God.
perhaps, or it might just speak to the unique relationship that God has with the Jewish people.
Mm-hmm.
Right, but yeah, no, but I do hear you. For being your God, right? Wasn't God already their God in Egypt? Maybe for the purpose of, in now parentheses, or perhaps for the purpose of being in more close relationship to you and be your God, did I bring you forth from Egypt?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as we've seen, many times, Egypt is not a place where you can easily connect to or find God.
Right. Right.
I'm not sure how he's exactly going to take the teaching, so we'll see.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of what he then gets at in this next section. Not just that Egypt isn't a place, or is a place where it's hard to connect to God, but actually in this Hasidic way of seeing things as we've come across over and over again, Egypt isn't necessarily a place at all, a physical place. But we can think of Egypt as a kind of spiritual state. And that's what he gets at here, I think. Whenever a Jew sacrifices himself for the sake of God's holy name, the exodus from Egypt is aroused, since the purpose of that exodus was to be a God unto you. Self-sacrifice means accepting upon oneself God's divinity, and hence the power of the exodus is awakened. It is by that power that one is able to perform the sacrificial act.
I wasn't expecting that definition of sacrifice. Self-sacrifice means accepting upon oneself God's divinity. I mean, maybe not such a big sacrifice, or maybe a huge sacrifice. I don't know, but I was thinking self-sacrifice means to do something that might really hurt you or harm you.
I'm curious about the Hebrew, if you have it, because whenever a Jew sacrifices himself, sounds like martyrdom, right? Self-sacrifice sounds like something much less potentially. So
the Hebrew is in the other room, but I can tell you that so that was my mistake. But I can tell you that self-sacrifice here is misirat nefesh. And it's the same verb here for that he uses when he says whenever a Jew sacrifices himself.
Okay.
In
the art green?
Yes, it's in the back of the art green.
Over there if we do want to consult it.
Yeah, I can step out for a second and grab it if need be. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of, to both of your points, what I mentioned was kind of challenging and interesting to me about this teaching is that this idea that we have in Judaism that we don't talk about so often, but it is there, of martyrdom and self-sacrifice is an idea that I find really kind of troubling and challenging. And so that's why what kind of piqued my interest about this particular teaching. Because I think that Rabbi Aby is right here to suggest that he's sort of redefining this idea of self-sacrifice, at least in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not really clear what he means by it or what he's doing with it.
I'd just like to, by the way, step out for 1 second to the fact that you're bringing a text that you're specifically having trouble with, which I love, because we have a tendency to sometimes shy away from those and say, we only want to bring these like beautiful texts that we agree with and we understand. And I think it's really great that you brought one that doesn't fit into that. So, Yasher Koach and Mazel.
Well, thank you.
Good struggling with Torah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm curious what this power of the Exodus is awakened.
Yeah.
That phrase means whatever you're sacrificing. Like I'm not sure what the result is.
Here's my translation. So what you're sacrificing is yourself. If you are an entity and a being, and if you're going to allow God to come into your life, you have to somehow remove a part of yourself from yourself. You have to sacrifice your being. And so if then God is going to become a part of you, I had this in my mind formulated to how to connect this, but I don't know. Then, yeah, right. The Exodus is God's, God kind of showing up in the scene and doing stuff for the Jewish people and saving them. God's presence is more manifest. So perhaps if you were, limiting yourself in some ways to allow God to be present, then God is now present and Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
That, I don't know if that makes sense, but.
I don't know if it makes sense, but I like the take of your first half.
Yeah.
As opposed to when someone is martyred, right? Or as opposed, which is like one extreme, and as opposed to the other, which would be like, oh, when you don't eat bacon, right? Which is like relatively other side of the spectrum to psychologize it in the way that the Hasidim do, to make it kind of parallel to Tzimtzum, the idea in Kabbalah that in order to create the world, God had to pull God's self back to create space for the world. And so here this is a pulling back of your ego, perhaps, is what I'm hearing from you, to allow God in. I like that.
Right. That's actually beautiful then.
Yeah.
God has to create the world through Tzimtzum, then we have to do Tzimtzum to let God in, or to create ourselves.
Yeah. And maybe just to build on that in connection with this language of, the Exodus, not just to let God in, but to let God redeem us. Which is, if we think about the Exodus, a kind of giving up of the self, right? The Israelites, their whole identity, their whole understanding of themselves was based on being slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And whether or not it's a good identity, a happy identity, we can imagine that it's not an easy thing to give up the basis of your identity. We kind of cling to that, even if it's something that doesn't make us feel good. We cling to these identity markers. And so maybe that's part of the sacrifice or the self-sacrifice that the Israelites had to do in order to be freed from Egypt. They had to be willing to let go of an understanding of their own, of who they were. But it's such an interesting phrase. The exodus from Egypt is aroused, which suggests, again, just like we've seen and I just said, that Egypt isn't actually just a physical place, but a kind of spiritual reality. So too is the exodus from Egypt, not just a thing that happened in history or in myth, but actually a kind of spiritual experience, a kind of spiritual power that he's saying here through our self-sacrifice, our surrender of our ego, we can experience as well.
Yeah, and that constancy of Egypt that you're talking about, that we've read about before, is actually, at least by the translation, supported by the text where it says, "Who brings you out from the land of Egypt," not "who brought you out from the land of Egypt."
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
The
Nice.
one who brings out, yeah, is the Hebrew.
Nice.
And power is actually koach in the Hebrew, which is, I don't know.
So then go ahead.
Perhaps by pulling oneself back to let the divine in, perhaps, as opposed to the actual story where God brings the children of Israel out, perhaps in this example, by allowing the God in, it gives us the strength to redeem ourselves. We receive the power of bringing out from Egypt. Not we receive the blessing of being brought.
Yeah, that's nice. We channel the power of the Exodus. We're not passive recipients of it, but we're actually active people through whom it transpires in some sense.
And then, because I'm still not sure, it seems like the progress is that first you have to accept God's divinity. But then it seems like you then perform some type of sacrificial act, even though self-sacrifice meant to accept God's divinity. It is by that power, right? The power of the Exodus is awakened, I imagine, within you or within the world if you do that. So it is by that power that one is able to perform the sacrificial act. He still hasn't. The sacrificial act is.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Start with self-sacrifice, which is accepting God's divinity, but now there's another sacrificial. I don't know. Maybe he'll explain it, but I don't.
Yeah, I'd like to perhaps retranslate that last sentence. In that limsor, the verb musar means like to turn, right? Like the practice of musar is turning your traits towards the positive. So I'm retranslating this as uvazeh hakoach yachol limsor nafsho hapoel. So and in this strength or power, one is able to steer their soul in an action.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it feels like, you make a sacrifice, and then God comes in, and then you get to make another sacrifice, which doesn't. There's basis for that in Judaism, but it doesn't make much sense to me. Whereas here, it's like you get the power to actually fix yourself.
I think I'm reading that verb differently. In the same verb as like misirat nefesh, is that the same as musar or is it different?
That's a good question. I don't know.
I don't know so well.
It means to sacrifice yourself or to give over.
To surrender. But I don't know.
Limsor, to give, to transfer, to deliver, to notify, to hand down. pass. But musar, which comes from that verb, is usually translated as like ethics or morals, because
Right.
you're turning, right? I think it's related to the root of like suru, from whatever that's in, like to turn.
Interesting.
I'm not sure about that, but that's what I'm going with.
Yeah, no, and I mean, I think what you're pointing us to is the kind of ambiguity about what it actually means to, in the Green translation, perform the sacrificial act. What is he actually talking about us doing? Especially because, as Rabbi Aby pointed out, there's a kind of inconsistency here in the order of operations, if you will. Step 1, self-sacrifice, which means accepting upon oneself God's divinity. Step 2, this awakens the power of Exodus. Step 3, through this power, you're able to do the self-sacrifice. But wait, I thought I already did the self-sacrifice as step 1, in which case, how is this different? What's going on? Not super clear to me. Let's see if he helps illuminate this. He's not going to just yet, at least. We're going to go back to another part of our opening verses. It says, in the midst of the children of Israel, to indicate that holiness is hidden in the collective body of Israel, since God's people is a part, literally the portion of God. So he's pointing us to something interesting in the text, right? I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel, within the children of Israel. Why does it specify it like that? What does that mean? What's the sense of that inwardness? And what he says is that holiness is hidden in the collective body of Israel. We are a part of God. I'm not actually sure what that really means either, but I like it. It's a nice idea. The sages said, in every house of 10 Jews, the divine presence rests. The use of house here means when they are truly one with a single heart. Actually, I'm going to read a little bit more because he kind of explains that last step at least a little bit, although it's still not super clear. In the midst of the children of Israel refers to the heart, since the souls are close and only the bodies prevent their becoming one. But an act of self-sacrifice denies the self. Then the person is truly joined to that collective body of Israel, and I am sanctified. So there are a lot of different movements going on here. Let's see if we can kind of break down the different steps of his argument.
Right. So he's I will be sanctified in the midst of this singular group. I am the Lord who sanctifies y'all, is the Hebrew. Who brings, I assume, y'all, yes, y'all from Egypt. Okay. So he's building off of this singular plural difference. My question here on this first sentence of this paragraph, it says in the midst of the children of Israel, to indicate that holiness is hidden in the collective body of Israel. Does that mean that there is no holiness in the individual itself? Or, which seems to contradict the previous paragraph, which seems to be saying, my individual self-sacrifice enables blah, 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 blah. Or I guess my individual self-sacrifice enables me to be part of the larger group, is what he's saying. Maybe.
I think so, because the second part talks about your own heart. So it does seem like it's an individual action.
Right. In the midst of my heart, by performing this contraction inside me, I have decreased my ego sense and enabled me to become part of the collective.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the ego sense here, he's aligning with the body and the kind of spiritual core of holiness through which we access God. He's aligning with the heart, which he's also aligning with the soul. And so if we sort of reorient ourselves away from aggrandizing our body, this is sort of how I'm reading this, then we find this connection to something, some greater collective than ourselves. And through that, God is sanctified.
Right. The problem is that I'm glad you brought. I mean, it's a confusing text.
It's a confusing text. Yeah, I have a hard time with it.
With two different ideas. One is that, well, the question is, does God exist in our collective gathering? So
right.
His first argument, or his first idea, is that God is hidden in the collective body of Israel, and something needs to happen in order for God to be present, sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, though, the sages said that in every house of 10 Jews, the divine presence rests. So actually, God is not hidden. God is totally present in the collective body of Israel. And so he's like, okay, so if I have these two ideas that either God is present and the collective God is not present, how do I make those two the same? What it is that it's only God is present when the souls of those individuals are truly one.
Exactly. I think that's right. That's how I'm reading this as well.
Did you say that sorry, I was reading the Hebrew. The holiness only comes out from the hiddenness when we are one?
I didn't say that, but that sounds
well.
nice.
Then maybe. Right. It takes the group to pull out the holiness, but we can only be the group by lowering the self. Yeah. Or davar acher, the phrase where it says denies the self is nital hagashmiut. Nital, like to grab or to raise, right?
Or libatel, like to nullify.
Is
I'm not sure.
When the soul is controlled, the physicalness is nullified. Okay, that's fair. Otherwise, it would be like it was like you raised up the physical, which would work too, but I'm going to trust the translation and you on the libatel.
But I mean, this is pointing me towards, I think, a fundamental paradox, which is, I think, also the paradox of the tzimtzum, the divine contraction that Gio mentioned, which is that what we're seeing here is that through what he's describing, through surrendering part of myself, through giving up part of myself, through lessening part of myself, through lessening myself, I actually become greater. Giving myself up, surrendering my ego actually expands me, which is not what you would think would happen. But that's what I think he wants us to understand.
Mm-hmm.
The process of self-contraction is simultaneously a process of self-expansion.
Right, which is an idea that in the historical context here makes probably felt more natural than it feels to us today. When is this written? 18?
Right around the turn of the century, actually.
Late 18, early 1900s?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, maybe we're past that point on a large-scale society at this point, but the Hasidic movement is still pulling back to the old, and the idea throughout throughout the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance, everything was very much communal. In Europe, you essentially had to be part of the Jewish community, or you had to be part of the Christian community. And if you were outcast by one or the other or both, you could not survive. And so there's such a sense of the communal being the most important unit, and and raising up of that communal cohesion for the sake of survival, that this mentality makes so much more sense than perhaps it does to many of us today, where we have this individualistic mentality. Where we'd say, what do you mean we become more? That doesn't make sense.
Yeah, totally. Nice. Right. It's
what I said earlier. I think what he's doing is he's saying, he's taking this verse really seriously. So I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. If you read that on its face, that means that God is not sanctified at a previous point. I will be sanctified means currently, at the current moment, I'm not sanctified. I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. Currently, I am not. So currently, perhaps God is hidden. And then the way, but yeah, so that's, I think that's a starting point.
Yeah, nice. That's a good point.
Of the sanctification.
Yeah.
I mean, I could be being sanctified now, and you're going to sanctify me again later.
It could be, but I'm just trying to figure out how he works these two ideas together, that either God is hidden or God is present. I mean, then you can say, it's a contradiction. God is in the contradictions, but sure, that too. But
right.
Or a command, like you will sanctify me, although I will be sanctified. But your bringing back to the verse there makes me realize we've been focusing on the I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel. That's what he's been focusing on. Next line is I am the Lord who sanctifies you. So there's this cyclical relationship.
Yeah.
Is God sanctifying us before we sanctify God, or after? It's not, or both, and during, or all the time. It's not really clear from the text itself. I'm not sure.
His teaching is that it's only going to happen once your heart is, once you've denied the self and you've kind of gotten rid of that physical, external body thing.
Yeah. And I think Gio's point is well taken, that this is not just describing a spiritual or psychological process, but a social reality as well. Which is not something I necessarily, this idea that like, I'm part of this greater American collective or Jewish collective. Those kind of feel like abstractions to me, not necessarily something that like I actually surrender myself in order to participate in. So I think that's a good addition to this conversation.
Right. Though we see, I mean, that's a large part of what's the current debate, right? Like, are we seeing ourselves as part of the collective, and therefore our responsibility is to stay home and not risk giving people coronavirus? Or do I have my individual freedoms and I can go out and like whatever happens, happens? And that is the debate right now.
That's true. Yeah. And what he is saying is surrender your individual self because you are part of something bigger, and that makes a real claim on you. Maybe that's too much of a stretch, but that's what I see here. Yeah.
Svan Emmett is pro staying home.
That's right. You heard it here first. Gio, would you scroll down just a little bit? Cool, thanks. So
that is why?
Yes, that is why the sages established that the exodus from Egypt should be mentioned in connection with the Shema.
Okay.
In reciting the Shema, we accept God's rule and acknowledge our willingness for self-sacrifice. Thus we become united and are reminded of the exodus from Egypt. So this is an interesting kind of twist on it, which I wasn't expecting when I first read this, the Shema to come in. What does that have to do with anything? But I think that actually what he's doing here is helping to clarify for us what he means by self-sacrifice. And that the Shema is actually, if the Shema is an acknowledgement of our willingness for self-sacrifice, then maybe the Shema can tell us what self-sacrifice is really about.
Mhm.
And there are a couple things in there. One is just, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. God is one, but as the Hasidim read it, that means sort of that everything is one. That God is not just that there's one God, but that God is the one. And to really accept that and believe it is a kind of self-sacrifice, because it's saying, my individual existence is actually not the real thing that I tell myself it is. It's just part of the real existence of the one.
And so this, some people would say this sounds very Buddhist, but I'd argue it sounds very Hasidic. This idea, I would agree and argue, this idea that we are our own distinct individuals is actually an illusion. It is that narrowing of the grand scope of things, Mitzrayim being the root of like a narrow place, Mitzrayim meaning Egypt. So we are in our own Egypt when we constrict the world into simply our individuality and our world and our existence. And so when we recognize this oneness of the divine, and not only the oneness of the divine, as you mentioned, but the oneness of everything, and that just as God is holy, we are holy, just as God is one, we are one, then we are taking ourselves out of this constrictive Egypt of the ego and the self-centeredness.
Yeah, totally. Totally.
That the sacrificial act, because remember we were worried about the word didn't make sense, the progression. It could still just be that accepting God's divinity. And so we say the Shema every single day. You need to re-accept this divinity every day, because it's not easy. And so whatever I think the sacrificial act is is still just accepting God's divinity, because you're going to get pulled back and forth between being yourself and then wanting to
Right. And not even every day, but twice a day. It's like you can't just say it and be like, cool, got it, I can move on now. But we live in this world and we do things and have experiences and desires and pleasures and anxieties, all of which contribute to the sense that we are our own distinct beings. And so in this way of saying it, the self-sacrifice isn't just something, I think this is what I'm hearing you say, Rabbi Aby, not just something that you like do, check, done, but actually something that you kind of have to constantly renew.
Yeah.
Because it's a constant acceptance of this truth about what God is and about what you are.
Yeah. The other piece is, I don't remember the teachings, but there are a couple of interpretations of the next line of the Shema, of Ahavta, that you should love the Lord your God with all your might and soul.
Exactly.
I think it's somewhere in the Gemara or something that like you have to basically sacrifice yourself for the love of God, with all your with all your heart, with all your they had with all your heart, XYZ, with all your might, with all your strength. They have different ways that you're kind of actually then sacrificing yourself for the love of God.
Yeah,
that there was a debate on that in Barachot, and it also has reflections of I think it's Akiva when he dies and he says, I can finally do it with all of my might. I can finally love God.
Right. So that's actually a moment of self-sacrifice.
Right. True historical, literal martyrdom. Yeah.
The third piece, sorry. The third
Please.
piece, you say Shema, hopefully you're saying it in a minyan. So we say it together and then we all become one.
Mm.
Perhaps that's why we close our eyes. Because we then forget the self.
Mm.
Nice.
We stop seeing those
That I'm
distinctions.
just throwing out there, but it's like, I am here. Shema. No, it doesn't work. Who am I?
I like that.
Yeah.
Because why do you put your hands over your face for Shema?
Yeah, I have a friend.
The best.
What?
What was that, Gio?
I like that one the best.
You like this one the best. What are the other? I don't even know why you do it. It's like the most basic Jewish act. You just go like this. You're like, oh, it's Shema time.
Danny, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna say I have a friend who describes it as playing peekaboo with God, which I always liked. But I always thought it was just like, okay, to really have kavanah, to really focus, to really, not be distracted by all of these things around me. But I like your point as well, is that like if I'm looking at the people in the community, then I'm thinking about themselves in relation to me as different, whatever. That guy's over there, that guy's over there. When I'm not seeing the physical relations, then it becomes easier to suspend my sense that I'm actually distinct from them in a deeper way.
It's beautiful.
I've never thought about it like that. I like that a lot. Thanks for pointing that out, AB.
Until he offered this teaching. Because he says we. He hasn't used we in the whole teaching. We become united and are reminded of the Exodus from Egypt.
Nice.
Right. This whole thing is both conceptually about the travel from the multiplicity of individuality to the oneness of group, and his language follows that journey.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, very nice.
I mean, I think that's also why you sacrifice. You sacrifice for the sake of some greater something, right? I don't know. I don't want to wax philosophical on sacrifice when I haven't really thought it through. But to be a martyr, not when we can think of the extreme of Rabbi Akiva or other folks, died for the sake of for the name of God.
Right.
Sacrificing even something at a medium level, lower levels, because whatever you believe in, I don't know how to finish that sentence, is compelling you. There's something greater that's actually beyond yourself that you're sacrificing.
Right.
You wouldn't just sacrifice yourself for yourself, would you? I don't think anyone who has like a huge ego ends up sacrificing. They make others sacrifice for them.
Unless the sacrifice will feed their image, but then you could argue it's not themselves, it's their image that they're sacrificing for.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe, I mean, it's not going to get edited or cut out, but scratch that. I don't know, what would you be you're
right.
I don't know.
It this talk I was thinking of earlier, and I think it still holds in my mind that this talk of the sacrifice and how we've kind of been interpreting it based on what he's saying, it reminds me of when people say that Islam means submission to God, and that a Muslim is one who submits their will to the will of Allah, and it feels very much like that. It's the self-sacrifice means the submitting to the divine will.
Mm-hmm.
Or to bring it back to Judaism, the traditional phrase of the acceptance of the yoke of heaven.
Mm-hmm.
What's the sacrifice? It's putting myself, I do prefer our interpretation of it's the negation of the ego, but it's putting myself under the authority of the divine. Being a servant.
Yeah. Cool. Should we read what Rabbi Dr. Green has to say?
Let's do it.
Awesome. The glorification of martyrdom, or willingness to give one's life for God's sake, has a long and unfortunately real history in the life of the Jewish people. How was the Sfat Emet to know that just 40 years after he spoke these words, the reality of forced martyrdom was to be the lot of all of his beloved Polish Jewry? Yikes. But self-sacrifice also has another more mystical meaning, which is the meaning we've been exploring. A person who cares not at all about bodily existence, but only about the presence of God, becomes part of a house in which that presence may dwell. Because that person's ego has been set aside. Room is made for others. Such a one is joined into the community that together bears God's presence in the world.
Nice.
I really like how he says this, and I find it very helpful, except I find this language of not at all about bodily existence less helpful to me personally. This alignment of the body with the ego, which it often is, but I think it also doesn't have to be, you know? But that's maybe a bigger conversation than we have the scope for. But yeah, go ahead.
Perhaps if he said, a person who cares not only about bodily existence, but also about the presence of God, which I would argue is more in line with a lot of the Hasidic texts that we read, right? You're not neglecting the bodily experience, you're using that experience in a way for the divine.
Yeah. I think, or if he had said, I wanted him to say something like a person who does not, elevate bodily existence or does not misunderstand bodily existence, something like that. Because I don't think caring about bodily existence is the enemy here, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It can be if it's done in unskillful and kind of diluted ways, but it doesn't have to be.
Raising the body and the ego to the level of idolatry would be the negative place that I would be more comfortable with saying here.
Yeah, some version of that. But okay, that's like my little quibble with this. Otherwise, I really like this second paragraph here. Yeah, when you suspend your ego, when you set it. I also like his language of not like self-sacrifice, but because the person's ego has been set aside. It's much gentler. I find that much more accessible and helpful. I don't have to destroy my ego. I just have to set it to the side,
Right, it's again that contraction. It hasn't ceased to exist. It hasn't been destroyed. It's just pulled back a bit.
Right. Yeah. Any closing thoughts or questions?
Thanks for bringing it.
It's challenging me to think about how God exists in the community. I think in a lot of these teachings, and a lot of I think about how God can be present for myself, or in my encounters, or my Torah study, or my prayer, or my, I don't know. But here it's talking about the importance of it existing, that this community bears God's presence.
Yeah.
I am left with that kind of thinking about how do we do that? Or what does that feel like? What does that look like?
Totally.
And also that, just play off of that in a different direction, just as the self can't become the idol, the community can't become the idol either. It still has to be the house for the divine.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, how do we have that community unity when we are all separate? But
yeah, for sure.
Not to keep returning to something.
Yeah. What prompted that question, Gio?
I was watching.
Right. Cool. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and good Shabbos.
Good Shabbos.
And hopefully, may we all return to in-person mystical readings on the Parsha soon.
Amen.